Donald Trump is appealing Maine's removing him from the ballot. Maine was the second state to remove Donald Trump from the ballot. They did this. It was really just the Secretary of State in Maine who unilaterally did it. In Colorado, there was actually a court case, and justices decided to remove him from the ballot. It was done in the legal system, but this was just unilaterally done by the Secretary of State in Maine, who just felt like, okay, Donald Trump committed an insurrection, and with the 14th Amendment, just like the state of Colorado, we're going to now remove him from the ballot because if you've committed an insurrection as an officer of the state, then you are disqualified according to the 14th Amendment. So she decided, well, then you're disqualified, even though he has never been charged with or convicted of an insurrection or treason or anything of the sort against the government. But he is appealing this ballot removal. The Maine Secretary of State has defended the decision to unilaterally remove him on her own, like some sort of dictator or czar. Here is her defense when she was talking to CNN.
Tell us, do you think that your decision will survive this appeal by Trump and possibly survive the Supreme Court?
Thank you for having me. What I think is important to recognize is this is the process in Maine. Maine is unlike other states whereby anyone, a registered voter who challenges a candidate's qualifications must appeal to the Secretary of State. I did my job that I was required to do under Maine law and the Constitution in holding a hearing and issuing a decision. The next step under the law is this appeal to Maine Superior Court, and then the Maine Supreme Judicial Court, and then the U.S. Supreme Court. And I, on the last page of my decision, suspended the effect of my decision pending the court process, because that is what's important, the rule of law and the Constitution.
Do you think it will survive the Supreme Court?
I'm going to follow the will of the courts. I don't know what the courts will do. Whatever the courts will do, I'm going to follow the law and follow the court's direction. Certainly welcome the United States Supreme Court to weigh in.
If they disagree with you, what will that mean?
If they disagree with me, Trump will be on the ballot. And like I said, I stayed my decision pending the appeal because it's important that the process play out. That's what our laws require.
Okay, the only problem with what she's talking about is she's saying, I'm here, I have to uphold the Constitution. But he's never been convicted of an insurrection or anything against the government. He hasn't been charged, let alone convicted. So what exactly are you upholding when you're thinking that in your role, your job as Secretary of State is to uphold the Constitution? Well, you're not. You're actually going against it. This person hasn't been at all charged or convicted. But she just decided to unilaterally make that decision. I don't know if she stopped and think for a moment, if she just thought, hey, no other state has decided to unilaterally remove him because of the 14th Amendment. Colorado did this, and Colorado did it in a very odd way. What Colorado did is the lower court said, yes, Trump committed an insurrection. We think he actually did, which again, they never charged him. He was never convicted in a proper court of law. But in that court, they looked at what they thought was the evidence and they said, okay, yeah, Trump committed an insurrection. But the lower court then said, but we don't think he could be removed from the ballot because he is not an officer of the state. And the 14th Amendment applies not to the executive branch or not to the president and the vice president of the United States. And there's even debate on whether or not it actually applies to members of Congress as well, elected officials. They're thinking that maybe more appointed officials. But there's this debate. So they looked at it and said, so we don't think, because of this debate, we don't think that Donald Trump is actually an officer of the state. And so the 14th Amendment, though we do think that he committed an insurrection, the 14th Amendment does not apply to him. So when that went to the Colorado Supreme Court disagreed because, again, there's some debate over who is an officer of the state. And the Colorado Supreme Court said, well, actually, we do believe the president of the United States to be an officer of the state. So therefore, if you think that he committed an insurrection and your ruling to not remove him from the ballot is based on him not being an officer of the state, well, we believe he's an officer of the state. So therefore, you have to remove him from the ballot. So they weren't really in the Supreme Court of Colorado. They weren't looking at whether or not he actually committed an insurrection. They were looking at whether or not an officer of the state applies to the president of the United States. That's what ended up causing them to remove him from the ballot. The lower court didn't look at really whether or not he was an officer of the state. They decided he wasn't. They just looked at whether or not he committed an insurrection. So the two courts they were looking at sort of two different parts of this and then making decisions individually on those parts, but then combined, they resulted in Donald Trump being removed. But the Supreme Court stated in their decision, we understand kind of the gravity of this, so we're gonna put a stay on this decision until this is appealed to the Supreme Court, which I believe I would like to believe that when this goes to the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court says, if you've not been convicted of this crime, you can't be then convicted of this crime. If you haven't been charged and convicted in the court of law, then we can't actually deem you guilty without having gone through due process. I would hope that the Supreme Court actually upholds that. But I suppose maybe there's a possibility they say, well, no, not in this. I mean, stranger things have happened. Certainly stranger things have happened. But I would like to imagine that they will look at the case and they will say, if you've not gone through proper due process and you have not been charged and convicted of this crime, then you can't be found guilty outside of that court of law and then have your rights removed from you without actually being convicted of the crime. I'm pretty confident that the Supreme Court will rule that way. But again, stranger things have happened. But it would be nice to know if Shanna Bellows, who the Secretary of State of Maine, if she had this thought at all of, well, he hasn't actually gone through due process, so of course I can't actually then say he's guilty of this crime that he hasn't actually been convicted of. But people don't seem to be thinking that way. It's also come out that Shanna Bellows is a big Democrat, really supportive of Democrats. And this was really obviously a very political move on her part. And she's disguising it under the protection of the 14th Amendment, when in reality, this is just clearly hyper-political. We do have this uncovered clip from Shanna Bellows in 2020, where she is talking about the will of the voters and integrity of elections. Watch this.
But that type of activity, so make no mistake, what we saw nationwide around the country in 2020 that created anxiety about whether the will of the voters would be heard, is those forces that would undermine our elections and the integrity of our elections and democracy are still very much at work nationwide.
Okay, so there she is. Those forces are still very much at work. Those forces of people wondering about the election, of course, she's talking about it in a negative way. She's saying like people that question the elections, those are the forces. When people are questioning whether or not they really truly are having a democratic process, those are bad, evil forces. And they are meddling in our election system. And then there she is. Just fast forward a few years. And she's wondering why people wonder about the integrity of their elections and if whether or not the will of the voter is actually being adhered to, if the will of the voter is actually what we're ending up with. She's wondering about that. 4 years later, she's the reason why it's actually happened. Those forces that she's talking about are her. She needs to look in the mirror. She's absolutely the person. It's appalling. It's actually appalling that a Secretary of State in a state like Maine would just unilaterally remove the leading Republican candidate from the ballot. That is astonishingly anti-democratic and just head-scratching that she would think that was even a good idea. I kind of understand the Colorado court a little bit, except the lower court, I don't understand why they would say that that Donald Trump was guilty of an insurrection when he was never even charged or convicted of it. But at least they kind of were like, yeah, he did it, but we can't remove him. And then it went to the upper court, and the upper court said, well, actually, he is an officer of the state, so I guess you have to remove him. So it wasn't, it was still, they were still playing politics. It's not good. Clearly, we've got a problem in the court system. Clearly, we have a problem with the Secretary of State of Maine. And there's plenty of other states that are continuing to pursue this avenue of trying to get Trump removed from the ballot rather than just running a better campaign as Democrats. If you are worried about losing the election, run a better campaign, have better policies, pick a better candidate. That's what you could do. Don't remove your opponent from the race. We've turned into a banana republic effectively.